Have you heard? Metro by T-Mobile now includes Amazon Prime. Yes, enjoy the best of shopping and entertainment, movies, TV shows, music, free shipping, and much more. All included for just $40 per line for 3 lines. All on the T-Mobile network. Discover the smarter way. Metro by T-Mobile. That's genius. One offer per account. Offer subject to change. $12.99 per month value. Offer valid for new Amazon Prime members. Metro customers may notice reduced speeds versus some T-Mobile customers. Video at 480p. Capable device required. See store for details and terms and conditions.
As humanity has been on the path of embracing diversity, one last minority is still unrecognized. Experiencers. These are the contactees, abductees, eyewitnesses, and researchers of the UFO phenomenon, paradimensional realms, and contact with other intelligences. Could it be that some protocol, some map, has been created by our visitors to integrate humanity into Paradigm Galactic? Could this be the experiencer path to disclosure? Welcome to Aquarian Radio, Friday night, with Janet Kira Lesson, Karen Christine Patrick, and the Reverend John Polk, and a guest on the experiencer path.
Hello, and welcome to the Experiencer Path on Aquarian Radio Friday nights. My name is Karen Christine Patrick, and we have a really great show for you, as usual, and a wonderful guest here on May the 12th, 2017. And I will read a little bit of a bio, but first I'm going to introduce my co-host, Janet Kira Lesson. Are you with us?
Yes, I am. Hi, I'm coming to you live from Maui, Hawaii. And everything's great. We don't have any impending storms to wipe out our communications like usual. It looks like we're going to have clear skies and good broadcasting.
That's great. And I just saw you. We went to the 6th Annual Mars Conference together, and we'll be chatting about that as we go along in the next couple of shows. It was a wonderful experience and wonderful to see you again. And Reverend John Polk, are you with us?
I am. You caught me tweeting, but yes, I was tweeting out the show.
I heard birds.
Yeah, and tweet. And anyway, now I'm posting on Facebook. So, yes, I look forward to it. I was just telling Michael that I'm a big admirer of his work, and he helps people to understand the very deep esoteric sciences that play into the whole ancient alien astronaut theory. So it's going to be fun.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to read the bio, and we'll have Michael Dennin come on with us. Professor Dennin has been professor of physics and astronomy at UCI since 1997 and is now the vice provost for teaching and learning and dean and division of undergraduate education. His research focuses on the dynamics of foams and modeling of ice melange in fjords. Boy, I love sciencey stuff, so that sounds really fun. He has won numerous awards for research and teaching and is passionate about public outreach in the area of science, including co-teaching an open course based on the AMC television program The Walking Dead. Hey, I want to take that class. That sounds fun. He has appeared on numerous television programs, including Science of Superman, Spider-Man, Tech, Batman Tech, Star Wars Tech, and Ancient Aliens. And you can find Professor Dennin in the YouTube series Fascinating Fights, debating the outcomes of battles between pop icons. Recently, he published a science outreach book on the intersection between science and faith, Divine Science, Finding Reason at the Heart of Faith, from Franciscan Media. He's on Facebook, he's on Twitter, and he's on Aquarian Radio right now. So welcome to Aquarian Radio Friday nights, Michael Dennin. And let me unmute you. Somehow our little Blog Talk Radio robot does that. Hello, Michael Dennin.
Hello. Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you with us. And it's Friday. We're kicking back. We're having a good time. We're just chatting. Maybe we're having sort of a virtual coffee house, and we're hanging out. So
right.
what we like to do with our guests is have them introduce themselves and give a good 10, 15-minute introduction of what they do, books, projects, and research. And then we go round robin and ask questions and make comments. So go ahead, Michael.
Okay, sounds good. So, as been mentioned, I love doing science outreach. So I've been a physics professor for 20 years. I now am a vice provost and dean, which just means I complain too much about how my colleagues teach, so they put me in charge of teaching.
Good.
Yeah, and so
now how to shut your mouth, huh?
Yes, exactly. But I will say, as you read the different things I do, you can see I probably do science outreach in what I would call the non-traditional venues. The superhero and pop culture space. There are some people who do that, but there's not a lot of us. Certainly not a lot of scientists in the ancient alien space. And the producers there really like me. I now have the nickname the Friendly Skeptic, which I like a lot. Because I think there's a lot of interesting science to discuss in that venue, and there's just a lot of interesting questions, independent of which side you come down on. It's still a fun dialogue to have and a lot of things to think about. And then the third space that's a little unusual is what I've been doing more of recently and which led to the book. I've been a practicing Catholic my whole life, but I have kind of an odd background in that my mom's Jewish and my dad's Catholic, so I'm kind of this mixed background when it comes to religion. And I've been a physicist, and I kind of got annoyed by the public discussion of science and religion. I felt that it got way too polarized and wasn't going anywhere useful. So I thought I'd throw my hat in the ring, and I wrote the book Divine Science, Finding Reason at the Heart of Faith. And it's really, I try and take a different sort of approach than people who debate these issues around science and religion. And my perspective is, let's be honest about our assumptions. You either assume God exists or you don't assume it. It's not something that's really provable. But it's interesting if you take one or the other assumptions to ask, what does that mean for how you interact with science? So I take the assumption God exists and then talk about a lot of interesting questions in science sort of in that framework. And it's fun because it's an excuse to talk about quantum mechanics. It's an excuse to talk about relativity, which people have heard of and like to hear about. But it's also an excuse to talk about, you read in my bio that I study complex fluids and foams, and ice melange and fjords literally is just ice chunks and fjords in Greenland that are being pushed by glaciers. And we study that in a lab using plastic particles that float on water between two plastic walls that we push with a plastic bar, and that's our ice and glacier. And these materials are interesting because you can't explain their behavior based on the behavior of the molecules in them. So a lot of science focuses on explaining things from the smallest pieces, and I look at explaining things from the larger, more coherent, we use the word emergent scale. And that's an area of science that people don't get to hear a lot about or talk a lot about, and the book was a fun excuse to write about it. And so, I do public speaking on the book, but I also talk about superheroes, and I do the Fascinating Fights, which is a fun example. I've started going to various Comic-Cons, though I've not made it into the San Diego Comic-Con, which would be like the big breakthrough.
Yeah.
And then, of course, next weekend I'm getting to go to Contact in the Desert. I'm doing something, I'm not sure how it'll work out. When I talk about superheroes, I have a great thing. It's a lot of fun. I call it Challenge the Professor, and people name whatever superpower or favorite superhero. Depending on the crowd, I expand it to Harry Potter, Star Wars, whatever their favorite pop culture thing is. And the challenge is for whatever they name, I need to talk about from a science perspective. And I've gotten very good at that, and I can do that very well. So I've proposed, and they've accepted, and I'm doing a workshop at Contact in the Desert where it's going to be completely open. It's going to be the same format. People can ask me any question related to any of the topics at Contact in the Desert and challenge me to talk scientifically about it. And it'll be my first time doing this challenge, so I'll be curious to see how it goes. But I'm really looking forward to it. It's a sort of format I find very exciting, and the audience gets very engaged, and it seems to work very well. So I don't know if you want more, but that's kind of, me in a nutshell.
I want to say I like you already because you said you were a friendly skeptic. I ran into the other guys a lot lately, so thank you for that. That's
You're
awesome. Go ahead, Janet, you start. We'll have John, and then I'll go in the next set of questions, and then we'll let Michael speak, and we'll just go around with our invisible talking stick from person to person, and it should be an amazing conversation. Go ahead, Janet.
I think so. Well, I think it's healthy to have a level of skepticism, but if you're too skeptic, you miss out on life, So there's some balance in between that continuum. Now, my husband and I are researchers, and we're investigating the whole field of ufology. I come from an experiencer perspective, so I have to be myself, the experiencer having these episodes with extraterrestrials, and then come back outside of it and witness it and try to make sense out of it, logically and somewhat scientifically. And anyway, I'm kind of in probably the polar opposite of science in many ways because I'm very spiritual, New Age. I live in Maui, hippy-dippy land. And but I combine it with anthropology and psychology, so I'm very eclectic. And so the things we investigate is the story of the Anunnaki, which has come into Comic-Con and other movies and become very popular as the Thor and what was he called? I don't know. I haven't watched the Thor movie. I should rent those or get them on Hulu or something or Netflix. Watch the Thor Marvel Comics. So Marvel Comics, which I, by the way, started out with Marvel and DC Comics when I was a child of the 60s and 50s. They've come a long way, baby, with these big Comic-Cons like San Diego Comic-Con, and even all the big stars want to get into one of these superheroes movies, and they want to be a superhero, So, what do you think? I'll put this in a question. I get that background. What do you think of the story of the gods? And let's pick Thor, who had his hammer Mjolnir, which shot out lightning. So he's probably Zeus in our history, which they make it mythology, but there's actually a lot of evidence that these are real characters. Scientifically explain Thor and his hammer, and how did he go back and forth from being that mild-mannered Clark Kent, doctor, I guess he was, to this big muscular thing that was beyond kind of normal. You couldn't kind of mask that under a suit, I don't think. So it was some kind of morphing, like the Hulk. Yeah, go ahead.
So, I think what's interesting, and there's kind of two interesting threads I find in human stories about the gods, or actually three. Let me say three. Okay, so one is sort of an obvious thread, which is explanations of how nature works, right? So I think from the beginning, when we could first talk, tell stories, write, communicate, draw art, as humans, we're fascinated with nature, and we noticed that nature had both patterns that were regular, but things that were also unpredictable. So, there's certain things about storms and lightning and thunder that they probably occur on a fairly regular cycle, but with enough unpredictability in it. I mean, even now, our modern weather can't always predict when they're coming accurately. Mm-hmm. And so, one of the first things you would do, and I think, is it would be very natural to try to explain the natural phenomena in terms of things that were familiar with you, that you were familiar with. So that's kind of the third piece, that is this idea that people I think, know the people around them. Some are more powerful, some are less powerful. Some can do more amazing things, some can't. So they would connect probably historical stories about people who were particularly amazing, connect that with amazing things in nature, and that's one possibility around how you get some of the gods from what I might call a pre-scientific perspective. You know lightning occurs. You need an explanation for it. You know that you're probably familiar with static electricity. Rubbing certain materials together can produce small sparks. It's a natural leap to then have materials like Thor's hammer that can generate large ones that are lightning. One of the things I think we often forget is that people, I think, for a very long time have been very intelligent. So just because we hadn't necessarily, as humans, invented everything we have now, we were probably still very, very smart at figuring out stuff and making connections. And I find that just very cool about people. I said there was 3, and I went from 1 to 3. What I'm thinking of is 2. So I did that on purpose. That was not by accident.
Okay.
Because when I first thought of your question, there is a second strand here, and I think that's the strand that's harder to talk about, and it's what I think the best word for it is what I would call the mystical or spiritual strand. Always challenging words to use because they mean slightly different things to everybody who hears them, but I think from the beginning humans have been attuned to the possibility that there's more in the world beyond just our physical experiences. And that's the other strand going through human experience as we as humans kind of struggle with and discuss the idea of gods and the divine. So you kind of have these 3 parts of our human experience weaving in and out of our various stories and what we're trying to figure out. There's the physical world and the very scientific. So I would say, once we discovered how lightning worked, and the physical properties of it, it wasn't like there was a Thor and now we know how lightning works and there's suddenly not a Thor. I think a large part of the Thor or Zeus. What?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I had a kind of perspective when I was asking that question. I thought that first of all we have all these renditions of these different gods, and when you look at the cuneiforms and the things on these people were giant. They were much larger than the normal human beings. And then we're finding skeletons, and we're finding them in deep layers, and we're finding different types of humanoids in the same layers as dinosaurs. And we're hearing this. You're coming to contact in the desert. You're going to hear some really far out hypothesis of the totality of existence and creation, all the way up to source from the first decision to subparts down into humanoid and reptilian and other types of beings upon which we could incarnate and have existences, right? These are our avatars, right? So you're going to hear all this, and I'm sure you're somewhat familiar, but this conference will blow your mind with all the information.
Yeah.
And you go in there with an open mind, or else you're going to be pissed off the whole weekend. So you might as well go. That's
it. Actually is a genuine thing. The word friendly skeptic. It's one reason I don't get pissed off.
Okay, good. So what I was thinking was trying to explain how the mechanics of the weapon that these people were genuinely carrying these their slaves, basically, their servants and their soldiers. They marched off to war as fodder for the different cannons and whatever how they were destroying each other. This was a slave race that was being used in many ways, from sex slaves to household slaves to soldiers. But Troy, this was a regular human type war, and then they had weapons that were way beyond the human technologies. So, and I think it would be logical. We wouldn't give, in today's world, a laser weapon to, the average person that's carrying.
Right.
So that is, I was wondering if you could explain what they were doing to make this ray come out. times resembled like lightning. It's kind of like Tesla, right?
Okay, yeah.
So that way. Yeah.
So if you wanted to talk about like how a thing like Thor's hammer might function, or Zeus shooting lightning bolts, the shooting of lightning and electricity is an interesting concept as a weapon from a physics point of view, because making it shoot lightning is not necessarily the problem. There are some challenges with it, but you referred to Tesla and such, right? Basically, to get something to discharge lightning, you need to build up a pretty large voltage in the object on one end, and then it'll discharge the lightning out. So an easy sort of a simple example of that, and people have probably almost all seen these at various points in science museums or other places, is the Van de Graaff generator. This is that big metal ball that there's kind of a like belt inside of it, and it spins, and the ball gets really charged up, and if you put your hand on it, your hair stands up on end. I don't know if that sounds familiar.
Oh, yeah. We went to the Buell Planetarium in Pittsburgh, and that's what we did.
Yeah. So that's fun. People like putting their hair up. Yeah. The other thing, like that's kind of static electricity buildup. You can do it more from a Tesla point of view. Basically, you generate a big rotating current in something, spinning a magnet or something like that. So you could imagine a couple of different ways I could take Thor's hammer and develop a very, very large voltage inside of it. Either inside the hammer's head, there's actually a spinning device, or the equivalent of the belt from the Van de Graaff generator that's going up through the handle. So I could do that in lots of different ways from a science perspective. The thing that's always a little disturbing from a science perspective of Thor using it as an effective weapon is it's almost impossible to figure out how to aim lightning. It's going to want to...
It's not really that they were witnessing lightning, is that they couldn't explain the type of rays that were coming out of these machines, which were focused, because the stories reflected they, would take ships out of the sky and do all kinds of stuff.
Right.
So it must have been something else. It wasn't really lightning, but the primitives in this day said, "Oh, they're firing lightning."
Exactly. So that would be kind of the step you would have to make. You'd have to realize that if it was something technological going on, you're right. It would not be lightning because of this property that lightning just likes to find its easiest path to wherever it's going. That being said, so then you would have to ask yourself kind of what would be the type of technology that would be useful for generating something like this. And this is where I also wonder, as the stories came down. So let's make the assumption that there was some sort of higher technology weapon that the equivalent of Thor was using, and it was some sort of ray-based, electromagnetic-based weapon. It would be most like a laser that we have now. That would be its most natural connection. And one thing I would wonder is, just like the primitive people of the time would describe it as lightning, I could also imagine them, recognizing it as a weapon, recognizing that it causes destructive damage, and even if it wasn't actually a hammer or a sword, or depending on which god you're talking about, then turning it into a hammer or a sword in their story, because that would make the most sense to them. They wouldn't necessarily understand something that was, fundamentally more like, say, a gun, right? If you're gonna make a basic, lasers are very common now, and if you're gonna make something ray-like, it would be laser-like, and it would basically be tube-shaped. So you might put something like a hammer on it, but it would be weird to do that from a physics and technology point of view. Now, you might do it from a psychological point of view, if you were trying to have a particular impact on the people around you. But it's also, and it's almost from a whether or not it was real in their point of view, it almost doesn't matter whether it's the people describing it use terms as a hammer just because that's what made sense to them, or the people using it made it look like a hammer to make it comfortable to the people looking at it, if that makes sense.
At all the different mystery technologies in the Bible itself, it's very interesting. You have Ezekiel's wheel, and I mean, what was Moses doing that he threw something down the ground that turned into a snake and then back to a rod again? So, what are your thoughts on what? I shouldn't take up the whole time, but I was just curious what you thought about what Moses was doing with this rod that turned into a snake and then back into a rod. What was the technology?
So I'll answer that two ways. The first way, so with most of these stories, like Moses turning the snake into the rod, Thor's hammer, Moses parting the Red Sea, I have kind of two I would describe it two views on that. My first view would be, in my hat as friendly skeptic, I would, and this is true of most things that happen like that, is I have no doubt that something really big and critical happened, that people were just totally amazed. What the challenge from a science point of view is, I also tend not to personally feel the need to take the stories literally. And once you're in that space, science, unfortunately, then no longer becomes a useful tool. Because these are one-time events, and science is about doing repeatable experiments. That doesn't mean they didn't happen. That doesn't mean you can't learn about them. It does mean it's a different tool. It becomes much more a detective mystery than a science problem, if that makes sense. So I often, when I talk about these things,
I don't use science very much because it doesn't take all the. It really doesn't work for me.
Well, so there's two things you can do, right? So you can look at something like the rod becoming a snake, and you can say, okay, if it was an event that was purely consistent with science as we understand it, is there a scientific explanation I can lay over that? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no. If the answer is yes, okay, that might be what happened. If the answer is no, unfortunately, you haven't ruled out this being a real event. You've just now eliminated one possible explanation for it, and you have to look for other explanations.
So what about the ability for humanoids to shape shift? As we see animals, we have these little chameleons, and they'll climb up on my rail that I've painted brown, and they'll shift to brown, and then so the story is that they're shape shifting from one to another. Is there any scientific explanation for shape shifting? Is that something that can happen?
Well, so certainly from the science side, we really understand. Well, we don't understand it super well, but we understand the color changing much better than we used to, because we have a lot of new tools to study it. In fact, it's ironic you picked chameleons and stuff. I literally 2 weeks ago heard a great talk on how people are taking the biology they're learning about, particularly octopuses, which do amazing color changes. And what's really shocking about the fact that an octopus changes to match what's behind it is it doesn't really have eyes that work the same way we do. So there's a lot of work to try and figure out how the octopus knows what color to turn into when it doesn't see colors the way we do. And, shape-shifting, again, tends to happen in animals that don't really have bones. Bones tend to be an impediment to extreme shape-shifting as opposed to, small amounts of shape-shifting. And so
somehow hypnotizing us into thinking, but it's part of their own defense mechanism. I'm going to shape-shift into a different form, just like a chameleon. Say it's sort of on an animalistic level, and now it exists. Here it is, millions of years later, in the macro or micro evolution of the species. They can actually appear to look like something else. Perhaps it was initially as a defense mechanism. Is that something that would be possible in your mind? I'm
sorry, I missed the very beginning of your statement, so I want to make sure I'm answering the right question.
Yeah, so let's say we were, we understand how, we've learned how they do this thing, right? We figured that out.
Right, the color shift, yeah.
So wouldn't there be some species, especially in considering the entire universe, that could actually either shape shift their form, maybe they don't have bones, or maybe they're able to project an illusion somehow, like a hypnosis, but they may not be aware of it unless, like, I'm going to hypnotize you type of thing. But it's just an automatic occurrence in response to their protection mechanism, which instead of shifting color, they shift their shape so they don't get consumed or whatever, killed.
Yeah, no, I think the first piece of that. So, I'm really fascinated by the possible impacts and ways you can influence a person's sort of mental view of the world. So your statement of some sort of hypnosis. There's also, there's your shape, and then there's how you appear. Right. If you can manipulate, we see only through light. Okay, and so we assume a shape based on the way light interacts with the object. And if I can, and we know, just look at a person in a funhouse mirror, right? Their shape can change, or appear to change, right? So if I can, if I'm made out of a material that interacts with light in very interesting and different ways, I could certainly create a different shape appearance than I had without actually changing my shape. From a science point of view, that's much easier to do. Changing your shape and then changing it back is one of those things that, like I said, if you're an octopus that has a very mushy body, that's relatively easy to do. But if you're considering a creature with some sort of rigidity like bones and things, moving from rigid to unrigid and back to rigid is an incredibly difficult physical process. So that's much harder to imagine from a physics point of view. But you're even without hypnosis, the idea that I can manipulate light through physical means, just like I said, the funhouse mirror does, is certainly not inconceivable, particularly as an evolutionary device. And it's one of the cool cutting edges of science that we're doing right now is manufacturing, much more complicated materials that manipulate light in very interesting ways.
And then I'll do one final thing. The reason I'm asking about that is because there's, David Icke talks about the shape-shifting reptilians, and even an ancient writing by Thoth, the son of Eki, the Atlantean, he said that he discovered that they were coming in, these shapeshifters were coming in and assuming the form of the council members and taking over. And Thoth said, beware that they're doing it, and they were discovered, and he got rid of them. And that was his story of why he had to sink Atlantis, because the shapeshifters were coming in from the inner earth or some interdimensional portal. And so, but he said the battle was not over, that these shapeshifters will come. And, of course, David Icke says that they're the shapeshifters are the presidents of all the world and the leaders of the world, and they're, the queen and all that stuff. So that was my final thing. Do you think there's any possible scientific validity in the ability for a species to shapeshift and look like a human, down to their personal characteristics and qualities that make that human, Donald Trump or the Queen Elizabeth?
Yeah, that's certainly much harder to imagine. When people ask me questions, I like to distinguish between what seems to be truly fundamentally impossible from our current understanding of science versus what's just very technologically challenging. And so changing. So the challenge in that is visual appearance is probably, not an incredibly. I can't think offhand of sort of a fundamental physics reason why I couldn't imagine a way to do that. That had way too many negatives in it, but but appearance manipulating light is something we understand as very doable. The challenge comes into to do it. So imagining it as an evolutionary defense mechanism, and as a way to avoid predators and a way to respond that way to the world, pretty easy to do, because the whole goal is to avoid contact with another species by appearing to be something you're not.
Right.
The challenge is to truly change your shape, like I said, runs into some potential real problems with fundamental laws of physics around entropy and randomness. And if you're only going to create the illusion, you're always running the risk of, well, what if somebody touches you? What if, all these other ways we can interact with people come up? So it becomes a lot harder to imagine that from a purely biological point of view. So you have to start thinking about, other processes. Now, a lot depends, for instance, how close, if you're imagining this scenario and you're asking a creature that's roughly humanoid to begin with, then trying to look like Donald Trump, okay, that's a different set of challenges than a creature that's radically different from a human looking like Donald Trump, because the challenges you face when you move into, perhaps ending up, in contact or other things are very different. If that made sense.
That makes sense. Well, thank you for playing with me.
Oh, no, you're welcome. This is what I do. These are fun things to think about.
I'll pass the talking stick to Reverend John Polk. Take it away.
Hey, Michael. I've been a big fan. I believe I saw you on Ancient Aliens dating back to 2009. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds like it's right.
Chariots, Gods, and Beyond, which is a spinoff of Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods, was released in March of 2009. And I don't know if you were in that episode, but you were in at least one called The Evidence. Remember that one? Where, they're trying to apply empirical science to prove some of these, creations by our ancients. And, you really have to start with science, since that's all we have here, since we're not necessarily privy to the esoteric, secret, sacred knowledge of the universe, but we're learning. We're on our way. Anyway, but what I like about you the most is that you can translate these deep esoteric sciences that are very complicated and difficult to understand, and you can teach it in such a fashion that really your novice who's just trying to figure it out can understand it much easier. And it's funny, you commented earlier how you're, perhaps maybe a little perturbed with some of the professors that you worked with because they don't teach the way that you would like for them to teach. And I guess maybe because they just don't know how to communicate the message so that it's palatable and easy to understand. So I think that's an absolute gift that you have. And it helped me to understand how science plays into the whole ancient alien astronaut theory equation. So anyway, just compliment to you. I really enjoy that fact about it, and you help me understand a lot about science and ancient aliens.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, that's what I think. That's why they keep having me back.
Yeah, I'm positive that's why. So UC Irvine. So they obviously know that you're on the show. And, you don't ever come out and say an extraterrestrial made this. You never really come out. I don't even know that you've even used the term extraterrestrial. But you don't have to, because you're explaining the science. And that's your function and your purpose. Among, you good color commentary also. I mean, it's funny because Karen and Janet and I and Janet's husband, Dr. Sasha Lesson, we're, with the exception of Karen, we're all going to be at Contact in the Desert. So I look forward to meeting you. But we're all Anunnaki. Yeah, we're all Anunnaki researchers. And just by chance, Ancient Aliens showed the special about the Anunnaki, and I've recorded it. I've watched it probably 50 or more times. But it was on, so what am I going to do? I'm going to watch it. And you even chimed in on that, I believe more in relation to Mars, because you have this sagacious knowledge and wisdom of Mars and some of the anomalies. And it's interesting that Karen and Karen's partner and research partner, Brett Collins Shepard, and then Janet and Sasha were just in Mobile, Alabama, for a conference that basically centered around lunar and Mars anomalies. And if you were there, you'd have fit in perfectly because I know you know how to talk about it. But there was something very interesting about Mars. You were talking about electricity and electric discharge and the Valles Marineris Trench. What caused that? Was that some kind of electric discharge weapon, some kind of super cosmic advanced extraterrestrial weapon? Was it water erosion? It looks like it has lines of strata, but it doesn't look like, a flow of water went through there. What is your best scientific explanation for the Valles Marineris?
Right. So that's a great example of a lot of the, interesting stuff that comes up when I'm doing the Ancient Alien show, right? So it reveals one of the challenges of science of the past, right? So you have this structure on Mars that, on the one hand, is not incompatible with just natural processes, and then you would, as a scientist, you either are challenged or people ask you, well, what is it exactly? And I kind of alluded to this in some of the earlier questions. The problem is it's a one-time event that happened in the past that we didn't observe, so it almost, by definition, removes it from the scientific explanations, because I can, unfortunately, and this is one of the challenges of talking about these things, I can unfortunately give you, water could have done it. It could have just been a collision of a particular type with, the right sort of rocks, followed by water and erosion. It could have been, if we look at, I was just, ironically, I was visiting my daughter in Ireland. These are the weird connections my brain makes. And we went to the Waterford Crystal Factory, right?
Oh.
And it's an amazing process to watch them make the crystal and blow the glass and do that. And, not all, many, I don't know how many, but certainly enough of what they make ends up with flaws in it that they then just smash and put back into the machine and melt again and start over. Because as materials form from a liquid to a solid, interesting structures often form in the process. So as Mars even first formed, it started from molten, basically, gas and dust and molten materials and things that are much more liquidy that eventually solidified. You're not going to get a smooth, nice sphere. You're going to get a thing with interesting structures in it. So the number of scientific explanations I can give to that are quite large. Likewise, I can give a number of, technological explanations if it was a planet that at some point was visited by an advanced race. So it's one of those things. This is why I find it both fun, but also interesting and challenging. Right? If you want to pin me down to an explanation, and I put on my true science hat, I'm going to be very evasive because I'm not going to be able to say this is it from a scientific perspective, because there's just not the right level of sort of evidence and experiment. But I can certainly offer interesting options. So if I can just give a completely different example, there's a series, now I wish I could remember where it was, but for one of the shows I was asked about a series of holes, I want to say somewhere in South America.
In Peru, the band of holes, is that what you're talking about?
I think that's what it is. And you look at it and you say, oh, this must have been a man-made structure of some sort. But we also know, it just turns out from sort of the physics research I do, in a lot of natural processes in which the system, there's a lot of energy being put into the system through heating or cooling or other methods, nature forms incredibly regular patterns. It's one of the things I studied in getting my PhD. And so when I looked at it, my first reaction, just because of the research I do, is, oh, that's a cool example of pattern formation. So again, depending on kind of what your experience is, you see something that happened in the past that you don't know how it happened, and your explanation of it might be very, very different. So it's one of those challenges when looking at natural formations. So it's an interesting question when you see things like that structure on Mars. And what's then fun is now, it used to be we only had 2 or 3 planets to look at in our solar system for how, what were, quote, normal structures to form. As our telescopes get better, now we're discovering planets everywhere, and hopefully soon we'll be able to figure out even more powerful telescopes and start imaging them. And that'll give us some really interesting, then you can maybe start getting more scientific about some of these questions.
Well, we probably really need to fly you and a team out to Mars to do an investigation.
Right.
Get a more definitive answer, but I don't guess that's in
sort of,
in
like
the budget.
Said, that does start working better, because then then you can start doing things besides just visual, right? You can actually look at the composition of the material in different you can just get more specific.
Well, in the future, we'll plan a team, and we'll let you assemble your
a trip
own team.
to Mars. I really hope that happens before I die.
Yeah, so let's completely go off subject. So I'm looking on Twitter. I just friended you on Twitter through my name and through another account I have also. But it says UCI students award $70,000 in funding to 8 local nonprofits through the new experimental philanthropy course. And I see you in the photo holding up a check for $10,000 to teen kids.
Yep.
So, we can't talk about aliens the whole time, but I thought human interest. I thought that was worth mentioning. And tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's one of the great things I get to do as dean and vice provost. So we run a civic and community engagement minor, where our students kind of learn about civic and community engagement. And we had an awesome opportunity this year, which was there's a group out there that funds philanthropy courses. And so the idea is you design and teach a course on how to be a philanthropist, which turns out, deciding who to give your money to is harder than people think. And there's a lot, because as the person who taught it pointed out to the students, it's not just about who to give it to, it's about who you're not giving it to. Right, by definition, if you give it to someone, there's people you're not giving it to, and so there's a lot that goes into the process. So the students actually had $50,000 real dollars from this foundation. We then raised another $20,000 in donations for the course, so they ended up with $70,000 to give away, and they learned about philanthropy. They learned about how to make decisions, and they actually worked in teams and vetted nonprofits and decided who to give the money to. And they gave the awards in different chunks, and the Team Kids was one of them.
That's a brilliant cause. It's a brilliant cause. I have a ton of questions, but I'm going to pass the stick back to Karen, and I'll catch you on round 2.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you, John. Oh, man, I got like a billion questions, and I really can't ask them all. You've got a lot of diversity of experience and background to kind of dip into. But I think I'm going to go to the thing that means a lot to me, and it has to do with the process of how humans discourse together about topics. And you had to differentiate yourself as the friendly skeptic. And, it concerns me because we run into the other kind so much. I work in a lot of different areas. It's the experiencer base is my main one. But I also work in the anomaly community. We had an anomaly event, Mars Anomaly event, this weekend, and one of the comments by one of the people who were there was that we had literally very high-level, research. This was, the whole anomaly field is people going onto the databases of NASA and the European Space Agency, et cetera, Chinese one, et cetera, and really looking at the photos. And some of these people, it's become an obsession, to look at it. And I think that's great because I came from a computer science background, and we used to say that we used to crowdsource, trying to find bugs, because if you got a lot of eyeballs looking at it, in the open source community and the Linux community, you can find bugs a lot faster than if you just have a small development team for proprietary software. So there's been a lot of wonderful work done in the open source, coding, but that's branched out to be open source, a lot of ideas, including academia topics and just, anything, all the ologies, right, now have, because we have the internet, because we have access to things we didn't have access to before, some of the independent researchers are really doing some really interesting stuff. But we kind of bang into a wall. We kind of bang into a wall of the professional grade. And I wanted to be a scientist. I had a grave illness in my junior year, and made the decision personally to go start a family because I honestly didn't believe I would survive the illness, and it made me really think about my priorities. And then I just never got back to regular academia because the third child I had disabilities. So I was a caregiver, and I also had a business in the computer field, and that's what I did. And in my spare time, a lot of downtime in caregiving once you situate them, study. I was often running at the things that interested me. And so I am an experiencer, but I consider myself what's called an integrated experience. It means I use my experiences as a jumping-off point to figure out, okay, what was that about? What was that experience about? How is it possible? Who am I talking to? How is that possible? And so, I think we get people who really do some interesting stuff, and they write books, and we have independent conferences and whatnot. But then we have people, literally debunkers, come in. They wander in and try to think, that we shouldn't even exist. I mean, they have some of them. We've had to make a list of some of them because they're so obnoxious. Or we call them trolls. The admins of different groups have to share, that guy, and we have to ban him. And we give them a lot of chances and ask them to, maybe they want to change their approach. And then they don't. And then we have people that just, this is all they do also. It seems like they have to stamp this out with extreme prejudice. It's non-scientific thinking, And I loved what you just said, because you said sometimes when you're looking at a problem, it isn't repeatable. So science kind of runs out of tools in some ways as far as pinning it down. But, you're still open to speculation, and maybe you said, using the forensic way, to discover a problem. Getting several theories at once. We have, in our groups, we have different people have differing opinions, and our admins try to make sure everybody's peaceable about it. And, okay, that's interesting, And when I talked this weekend, I said, I think of having a third place for information, not either and not or, but just kind of we used to have a table that we put a jigsaw puzzle on it. Everybody in the family helped put the jigsaw puzzle together, and it was just kind of there. And you'd have this piece you didn't know where it fit, and good, it fits right there. So I was trying to make sure people had some tools of the mind to be open to hearing what other people have to say and be cordial, friendly. I love friendly. That works for me. And that's the most interesting thing to me is how do we as human beings, with these new tools that we have to share with each other, and we have the professional science people reaching out to the hobbyist or, very enthusiastic amateur, or even somebody who's, really gotten into it and got an independent thought that's very profound. What's a way to kind of bridge those, things and make it more of an open discussion? It sounds like you're doing that, and I would love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Hold on, I was a little slow unmuting there because I had it muted just so. Because
I
mentioned earlier to avoid the cough.
I just threw the stick at you.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
So, this is something. I'm going to sort of go through a random walk of a story, which I think kind of gets at your question, just from sort of my own personal life. So, I've been a practicing physicist, forever, it seems. As I mentioned, I'm born Catholic, raised Catholic, and very much believe in my Catholic faith. So I have that religion and science thing going on in my life. Then I joined the Ancient Alien TV show and entered that space. And so a couple of years ago, and it's embarrassing because I can't remember the name of the conference, I actually went to my first kind of UFO-type conference and spoke at it because of the work with Ancient Aliens. And it was fascinating to me just to meet and chat with people and get this kind of other perspective on life. And one of the things that I think is often missing in the conversation and the dialogue, because a number of people came up to me and said, isn't the possibility of aliens, contacting people now or contacting people in the past really interesting? Why wouldn't scientists study it? And I said, of course it's really interesting. That's never really the question. It's certainly a fascinating topic. And also, I think we don't do enough to acknowledge that people's experiences, for the most part, are probably real experiences. Now, the problem with life, and it happens in all walks, not just in this area, right, is there are frauds, and they do get documented. And that tends to be a problem then. Once you document a real fraud, then everything's assumed to be a fraud. So that's, if we ignore that for now, which you do sort of have to recognize in the conversation, but I think is less relevant, you're in a situation where people are really experiencing things, and people have for the entire history of humanity, and then written it down, or talked about it, or told stories about it. And I think you said something really important in your question or statement, which was, we have these experiences, and then we try to make sense of them. And we have different tools for making sense of them. And I think that's really kind of the next step is, for a long time in human history, we didn't have science. So it was hard to make sense of what I would call the clearly just physical experiences and physical reality. Science has been incredibly successful at explaining that part of reality. And I think it's hurt a little bit by its great success. So because you're really, really good at explaining A, doesn't mean you can explain everything. And that's kind of the challenge we have when you have experiences or things that at the surface appear to be anomalous or not explainable by science. Because you run into the challenge of, if you can't explain it by science, we don't as humans have great, an equally powerful agreed upon tool for our language for discussing. So you do get what I would call maybe the more angry or aggressive skeptics who their basic presumption is everything is explained by science, so nothing is really an anomaly. So if I can't explain it, that just means I don't have enough science evidence yet. And if I had enough evidence, or I could repeat the experiment, if I could do different measurements when I was there, I would be able to explain it. Now, that statement is possibly true, but not guaranteed enough to be true to be justified getting angry about, in my opinion. And the challenge is, how do you identify the things that have a scientific explanation from those that don't, and if they don't, what is the other explanation? And so this is why I remain, as I said, very much a friendly skeptic. I'm very upfront that I both think almost everything we experience can be explained by science, but I also think there is more than just physical reality, so there's something else to human experience that we have to understand and explain. So
very
I think that
excellent.
answered your question.
That was good. And we need more people like you, and we need I love that you're engaging kids. I know that the situation with kids it's very interesting. We have a young person in our home. She's in her 20s, and she really went through a lot of turmoil in her schooling era to try to, she literally had to fight for things for her schooling because they kept putting her in special ed because she has a hearing loss, but she's very bright. And I know that when I talk to kids, they're just struggling so much with family issues and all kinds of things. And that, basically eventually impinged on my academic career. But it's like, we're in probably the weirdest part of our science right now is Freakonomics. The economics are changing. The internet is changing how we do work. I mean, there's a lot going on, and I appreciate your work with young people because I think they probably need more encouragement than ever to, pursue their dreams and figure out what they want to do, it's a difficult time, and yet it's also very exciting because, you literally have, I'm a smartphone junkie. Oh, my God. I love having where I can look up anything in the world because that's, when I was a kid, I had to do the card catalog thing in the library and everything, So I went into computer science just to get a jump on all that was coming online. And my career was, I was in the early part of when I said I was there before the internet happened, so I watched it happen and participated. But it's like what happens there's an acceleration of gathering data for just any question that you have, and the big thing here too is the researchers have so much more access to each other. That's got to be accelerating how we work things out intellectually, collectively. And it's an exciting time. It's a bit of a frustrating time. I think it's very important to be cordial with people and not get, personal, and maybe go see a therapist. Kind of chill out a little bit. It's just a discussion, and I know people get passionate, but it's so important to learn how to embrace diversity and communicate with people of all kinds, because you just never know where you're going to hear something, and it's going to be this amazing idea that's going to change your life if you're open to people and you can be cross-cultural, intellectual, So you can go ahead and comment, and then we'll go ahead and have Janet come back on. But thank you so much for being the friendly guy. I appreciate it.
Oh, no, you're welcome. And I think, and I think you said something important. It's see, because it goes the other way, to be honest, right? One of the things I found is if I'm not friendly, no one's going to listen to my explanation of where the science and the science view is. So I shut people off to me as much as I shut them out. And I think that's a piece that's often overlooked.
Thank you.
One really quick thing.
Oh, go ahead.
Wait, before you hand the stick, I did something really, really dumb. I forgot to get myself water before I made the call. Can I take 2 seconds and go grab water?
Oh, absolutely. We don't want you to die of thirst in our little cafe here. So go ahead. And
I will be right back. Thank you.
Okay. Janet, did you have any comments that you could, fill it in what we were talking about, and then pick it up when he comes back in?
No.
You should tell us a bit about Contact in the Desert, so everybody knows about that event.
Well, I was starting to think about what I was going to ask about, because he has a presentation, let me get to where that page is. Hold on. And it is, hold on, where is that? Sorry. Not there. Here it is. No, that's not it. Okay, I got to close some screens. There we get too many windows open. I must have lost it. Anyway, on Aquarium Radio, I'll go back to Aquarium Radio. Oh, here it is. I have Michael Dennin's page that I've created on aquariumradio.com. And you can go there and check out his workshops. He's got a Sunday workshop called Stump the Professor Challenge, Aliens in Space version. We talked about that earlier on the show. And when Michael comes back, I want to talk about how might space travel...
I am back, by the way. Sorry to interrupt, but thank you so much for letting me do that. I can't believe I planned everything else except having water to drink.
Well, most shows have breaks, but we just power through for 2 hours. But feel free to say, I got to take a break, and then we'll carry on without you. So I'm here on Aquarium Radio Network, and I've interviewed thousands of people at this point in my life on the radio show, and I've talked to, hundreds in the field. I go to conferences all the time. I'm obsessed by this. I study this morning and night. And so one of the big questions has been, how might space travel be possible? Now, I am an experiencer. I have been on many craft. I have whistleblowers that I've interviewed. And I have a friend who has flown what they call the Roswell craft. And then I talked to Greg Cameron, and he says, yes, in their group up in Canada, they get people, now it's starting to be so more public, but, there's still stories that they weren't polluted by other stories. And so he was encountering people that have been flying these craft, and what they found that it was powered by the mind. and some required you to go and stick your hand in this little hand area and pilot it that way. And even our own science, we're looking at, allowing these technologies that the pilot gets to pilot the ship with their mind or their energy. And then there was that famous craft on the moon with the alien that was discovered during Apollo 20 or something.
The Mona Lisa.
The Mona Lisa, yes, the Mona Lisa, and she's got these rods on her eyes and on her face that seem to, she can pilot the ship based on these rods that are attached to her face. She might move her eyelids, or she might move her mouth. She should go right, left, up, down, whatever. I'm not sure the technology. She's dead, but they found it. So it was an interesting concept, and it's part of the UFO folklore, which is backed up by quote-unquote evidence, which is movies and documentaries and research and yada, yada. It's a very exciting field. But, and then I've been on the craft, and the peers, when I would ask, how's this happening, it's like, well, we're doing it. But that doesn't exclude people like William Tompkins, who is, they didn't get him for contact in the desert this year. It's interesting. He's going to the MUFON Symposium in Vegas in July. William Tompkins has a book, and I highly recommend it. It talks about the technologies and how we have been in space, we are in space, and, of course, how that will come about when we will go to space in this level program, which is a public program. There's the Breakaway Civilization Space Program and the public space program. So I'm curious about what you're going to say in this lecture, but I don't want to give away the whole lecture. But an overview. How might space travel be possible? Over to you.
Oh, yeah. So I think, there's two separate interesting questions there. But the simplest one is, I really should have. I should have actually. Now I just realized made the title slightly different. How is space travel possible in a reasonable amount of time?
Okay.
Right, because I realized as you were asking that, I was thinking about it. First of all, we've already been to. I mean, even if you only accept what I would call is the most orthodox science community viewpoint, we've been to space, right? We've been to the moon.
Right.
And we've certainly sent plenty of spacecraft to various parts of the solar system. We know how to build something that can survive in a vacuum. We know how to make a propulsion system. We know how to make, sort of an artificial environment. I mean, we've had astronauts up in the space station for, plenty of time. So space travel itself has never actually, for a long time now, hasn't really been the issue, right? The interesting question is, how do you travel through space in a reasonable amount of time? And just as a talking about science junkie, it's one of my favorite questions because it allows you to talk about both special and general relativity, which are the two things Einstein's most famous for. Most people have heard of them. Most people, have a little bit of a concept of the words around it, but I think it's easier to explain in general terms than most people give it credit for. So it's fun to talk about with the general audience, and it really lets you understand a lot of the both sort of challenges and interesting possibilities out there. You realize that one of the good news is, which doesn't reveal too much of the talk, still want to come along. As far as I can tell, and I haven't had any of my colleagues actually tell me otherwise, we haven't ruled out the fundamental possibility of kind of warp drives and bending space and time and wormholes. We don't really have the physics that can explain or understand it yet, but we certainly don't haven't been able to rule it out. there's a weird thing about physics as we understand it now. I can both make the sentence that special relativity has ruled out faster than light travel, but general relativity allows us to get around that in interesting and fascinating ways. So it's kind of an interesting two-part story that makes thinking about space travel very, very fun, but also kind of practical. So that's trying to not give away too much, but tell something interesting version of my answer.
Yeah, I like that. Thanks. So in my mind, it's like we have all these things that our science is discovering, and what I know from the whistleblowers and from what experiencers are being told is that our technologies are thousands of years behind what's out there. So even though we can think of all these possibilities of how it will happen, there's a possibility that we can begin to think about how it actually really does happen, what they're using. And when I've been on craft, they've said it's all in the mind. So it's kind of like the Moody Blues. Thinking is the best way to travel. And somehow we can pull our thought processes together and create something that appears solid or is, what Dr. Michael Newton Institute, which is the Life Between Lives researchers, and they progress people. Like I think right now there's about between 40 and 50,000 people that have been progressed to the way of life between lives, and they have thousands of facilitators, and they've been documenting this between 40 and 50 years. And what they have found is that there's a point where we are actually terraformers and planet formers, beyond this 3D avatar form in our higher self type of perspective. We're actually creating spaces to gather, interact, and once we leave, we dissolve it into its molecular structure. And if we want to gather, we just create another place and we travel there. If we want to be on Mars, want to be in space, want to be in the universe, we are just there. And then that, of course, is supported by the story by Thoth in the Emerald Tablets of Thought. Thoth, he said that there was a point where he was able to break his own form down into its molecular structure and travel through space, of course. And so it wasn't a problem. The vacuum wasn't a problem, or whatever the environment or lack of environment is like in space. So I just wanted to put that out on the table, and you might have a comment on that. And then after your comment, I'd like to just pass it over to Reverend John.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really, you alluded to that's going to be very, very interesting as we move forward is in that area of sort of consciousness and experience, right? One of the fascinating things about science is, if you went back, I don't know, I'm losing track of time now that I get older, but I don't know, say 15 years ago, and you asked astronomers, if there were planets around other stars, you'd probably get the answer no, because we hadn't found them yet. And now, of course, we know that they're everywhere and they're ubiquitous because our telescopes are large enough to find them. So we also see that we're really slowly starting to make interesting progress in the area of consciousness and what the mind can really do, but also in the general area of virtual reality and what really is experience. So, even though I think most scientists would be very skeptical of, the way you explained and the way you said it, I think there's a cautionary tale there as to we don't really, with our own current science, maybe know enough to know what to rule out or what to say is possible yet.
Yeah, so that's why I don't just rely on science. That there are something called testimonials. So you have 40,000 people that are being progressed into, these are all different faiths, religion, colors, creeds, countries, and they get progressed into where do you go when you die. A huge amount of commonalities to the story beyond random probability, and you have to look at it because in the court of law, that level of evidence, you can convict people and execute them, right? So there's not just science when we look at information and we're evaluating what is the collective conscious, consensus reality and how we're going to operate and proceed in this world of true existence. And
yeah.
So,
Oh, I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry, but yeah, no, I think, and that goes to, like I said earlier, things switching from sort of a scientific question to much more that sort of detective, court of law, a different type of question.
Right. So isn't it true in science that unless there's the observable that the quantum particles don't really move or something? I'm summarizing something. I might not be saying it quite correctly, but...
Well, yeah, no, there is an interesting challenge in our current understanding of quantum mechanics of, the role of the observer, that, right, until something's observed, it's unclear if it's happened, but then it becomes unclear how to define an observer. So, yeah, that is an interesting sort of very active current area of research.
Right. So if you take it from that same information from the spiritual perspective, it's talking about we create our own reality, the law of attraction and action. And then you take someone that bridges those worlds like Nassim Haramein. I don't know what your opinion is of him, but he was he has brilliant presentations, and he was kind of mapping and charting mathematically consciousness and the singularity within each and everything and everybody, and he put it in a line, and then he was, he has a wonderful graphic where the singularity is like the black hole. So there's a black hole within each and every one of us, and they all go to the same place in the quantum reality, which is kind of proving mathematically God, the concept of in New Age community of oneness. So I'll let this go to John, but one of my things that my family used to do is argue religion. Maybe we can do a third. We have about 40 minutes left. So I'm going to let it go and pass it to Reverend John. Take it away.
I wanted to talk about technology of the ancients, and the technology of the ancients that defies even some of the technology that we have today. And so let's start, if not at the top, close to the top, with the Ark of the Covenant. And I can remember an episode of Ancient Aliens where you're trying, or not even trying, but you're breaking it down scientifically to explain to us how it possibly can function, how it can possibly function, and how it applies to today's science. And you used the term capacitor. And I believe it was either Giorgio or Jason Martell. I think it was Jason Martell that was with you as you were going through the demonstration, and you had your whiteboard, and you're drawing the capacitor, your positive charge here, your negative charge here through the cherubim, and then you also address the mercy seat, which is where the electricity between the wings of the cherubim would create an arc, and that was interpreted as God. And clearly there's so many misinterpretations of God in the Bible, in Hebrew Bible, and a lot of biblical and religious texts. But let's start with the Ark of the Covenant and how you explained to everybody that it's a capacitor and how the capacitor works.
Yeah, so the interesting thing with that, and you're right, I'm pretty sure it was Jason who was in that episode, not Giorgio. I always forget who got to come in and do which demo with me. But one of the questions in that was, would it be possible and to make large electric discharges with something like the Ark of the Covenant? And the interesting thing is, that's the sort of an arcing between the angel's wings or some sort of electric discharge, that if you touched it you would die from an electric shock, is one of the easier sort of ancient technologies to think about because of both the structure of the ark and the structure of a capacitor. I mean, basically, a capacitor is any time you have two conductors that aren't touching each other, that have some sort of insulator between them. It could be air, it could be wood, it could be any of a large number of materials. And you're therefore, once you have that, you can build up a large amount of charge through static electricity, easy enough to do, on one of the plates, creates an opposite charge sort of automatically on the other plate, and until you connect them, the charge won't flow. It'll just build up. But if you have kind of the two poles, like the wings on the angels, and those actually make very nice electrodes and poles because they come to a sharp point. And the more pointed a conductor is, the stronger the electric field, and the more the energy gets concentrated in the point, which is why if you build yourself a lightning rod for your house, it's a long rod with a point at the end. The point's what makes sure the lightning hits the rod and not your house. And so you do that, and then you can build up enough electric charge that you get, a discharge between the wings. And so it was interesting to me as one of the demos and things to do. So we actually got to have fun. We have one of our really big capacitors that we use for our physics demos that we charged up and discharged. I can't remember if we ever got a good picture of the discharge that they actually put in the episode. But it is a nice example, and I think that's one of the, Jason and I have talked about this a couple of times. One of the challenges and cool things about ancient technology is, for a large chunk of human history, the view around technology and technology breakthroughs was to be secretive. And that's an aspect of science, modern contemporary science, that I think people often don't realize the power of. That at some point, as you got Galileo and Newton, and as you sort of moved into the Enlightenment, people's attitude became to share our discoveries as much and as broadly and as widely as possible, right? I mean, people often joke about the publish or perish aspect of academics, but if you think about it, it's a system designed by which you only get credit if you share your idea as widely as possible. Whereas not far back in human history, it was all based around guilds, and really, as a guild, you'd want to keep your technique secret. If you found something better than other people, keeping it secret was your economic advantage. You didn't have really the equivalent of patents and copyrights and a legal system that allowed things to be somewhat public. And so one could imagine that there is probably a lot that humans figured out how to do that then was lost because either the guild died out or the information just, disappeared. And so that makes a lot of looking at ancient technology particularly fascinating from a science point of view, is trying to guess or think about how it might have been done. And like I said, from my perspective, as these things go, the Ark of the Covenant is one of the easier ones to imagine because a capacitor would be a fairly relatively simple technological device to both discover, build, make, and use.
So what was the power source of it then? Giorgio described it as a nuclear device. So it had a nuclear battery on it? I mean, I don't understand what they carried it around by poles underneath, a cloth so it wouldn't kill them. What was the power source? What's your best guesstimation on that?
Well, the nice thing about that is the way you see it depicted and used. You really can think of it being as a static electricity device. And the thing about static electricity is with enough work, you can build up a very, very, very large charge. And so you don't have a device, because it's not a device that's presented as releasing the electricity sort of in a steady stream for over a long period of time at high energies. Like we think of modern electrical power as having these power generators that run because basically we're using the electricity all the time. So that's why you have a nuclear power plant or a hydroelectric plant or a coal burning plant, because people are constantly using electricity. So in physics terms, power really is technically the amount of energy you're getting per time. And we want our energy over a very short time, so we need a lot of power in the technical physics sense. In this sense, all you cared about is building up a large amount of energy, but you didn't mind if it took a little bit of time because you'd want to discharge between the wings at a certain time when people are looking at it, or you'd want to have it stored up so that if someone touched it, they would get electrocuted. So static electricity is fundamentally a process of rubbing the right materials together for the right amount of time. And that's a technology that would easily be available to the people of the time. And so that's why the Ark of the Covenant, to me, is, when I think of characterizing things as technologically possible but really hard, violating fundamental physics, most of the things that come up around the Ark really fall into the technologically possible side.
So let's morph not necessarily into the Bible technology, although we could, but the piezoelectric effect and how it plays into pyramid power and the pyramid grid system that was built on geodetic markers, supposedly harnessing upwelling of earth energy, and how that all plays together in the supposed concept of the earth grid creating some kind of free energy tapping into Gaia or Mother Earth's spirit. What's the best way to explain that, and do you believe that that was really feasible, that it did happen or not?
Yeah, so I'll start with the easy one since it's an opinion question. It strikes me as way less feasible than, say, the Ark of the Covenant doing something. But, now I'll go to the more, the kind of interesting question, and then I can come back to why I say less feasible. When you start thinking about, power from, sort of geological features and actions and the pyramid structures and things like that, it's interesting, that you mentioned the piezoelectric effect, right? Because people will often look at pyramid structures and talk about pyramid structures and try and discuss it from kind of an electromagnetic perspective. And the challenge is, at least the pyramids we know of, it's really hard from a physics point of view to imagine electromagnetism working because of the nature of electromagnetism and conductors and how those things function. Now, the piezoelectric effect is something that's less familiar to people and very interesting. And so very briefly, it turns out that there are certain materials that if you stretch or press or compress, by applying pressure, you can generate electricity. And one of the most interesting ones in modern times, and I always have to make sure I get the right one, I'm pretty sure it's wintergreen lifesavers. When you chew them, they spark.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And I apologize to any listener who goes out and tries to use wintergreen lifesavers and they don't work, because I might have it wrong. But I'm pretty sure it's the wintergreen lifesavers, and the reason is the way they're made, they're actually piezoelectric. So when you crush them with your teeth, the crushing creates a small amount of electric voltage that turns into a small spark. So if you turn off all the lights and you chew wintergreen lifesavers, they should spark. And if I have it wrong, I'm sure Google can tell you which thing to chew to make sparks, or Siri, or whatever your favorite search engine is. And so what's intriguing by what you brought up is, the concept of using pressure and compression and material properties to then generate sort of electrical responses. Now, we do that in our modern technology. There's a lot of modern technology that's piezoelectric. A simple thing is a lot of temperature sensors rely on the fact that if you change the temperature of the material, it expands or compresses, and if you build that into a potential electric circuit, as it expands or compresses, it changes a voltage, and then you get an electric signal, and that electric signal tells you what the temperature changed. So we do use it in modern technology. The reason I gave my first answer of harder to imagine is the leap from sort of generating kind of small electrical pulses from pressure to using it in some useful way becomes much harder to imagine how it would be done. Again, it doesn't necessarily automatically fall into the category of I can't tell you a physics reason why it's automatically impossible, but it just does start to fall into the area of, from a science perspective, much harder to figure out how or why it would be used in that fashion. So hopefully I started to answer the question. If I missed something, definitely follow up.
No, what I like is the escape clause that you're using, because we can't explain everything, and instead of being just diehard science, if I can't prove it with our primitive science, and there's species millions and billions of years more evolved than us, but if I can't prove it with our primitive science, then it's not real. And you don't do that, and I applaud you for it, because a lot of scientists do, and I think it hurts their expansion of their mind. So, so let's move on to batteries. Oh, wait. To finish my thought, most people that I know and I've met personally that use crystals, I know a lot of healers that use crystals, and you spin the term piezoelectric effect at them, they have no clue what you're talking about. They've never even heard the term before. And it's like, you need to Google that.
Yeah.
because you use the term vibrate mechanically on Ancient Aliens, but I also believe that through that mechanical vibration that there's some kind of spiritual vibration. I don't know if it's measurable or not, but, I use crystals in meditation, and they amplify the signals I send and receive and whatever I'm doing. So there's definitely something to it. But light bulbs, the Dendera bulb and the Baghdad battery, can you explain those to us? The Dendera bulb that was fashioned in the hieroglyphs and some of the Egyptian pyramids, was that a bulb? It looked like it went to a Baghdad battery with, you could see a cord coming to it from it as a power source. And I saw you do a recreation of an ancient battery on Ancient Aliens, and that really helped to explain it, with the sawdust and everything else.
Yeah.
It really helped to explain the battery better than I'd ever seen it presented before. And then after that, we'll send it back to Karen because we're running out of time.
Sounds good. Yeah, no, again, this falls into, on the one hand, the easy piece, the batteries, and I do think, it's fairly likely that batteries were repeatedly discovered throughout human history, because if nothing else, if I happen to stick some metal into a lemon, I end up with a battery, because basically the battery just needs some very weak acidic solution to interact between two metals and something like the sawdust or a brief insulator between them. So you may recall we actually lit an LED light with the battery I just made out of some metal plates, some copper sulfate, and the sawdust. And so, I think we generated 5 volts with no effort whatsoever. And so, when you look at sort of the history of human technology, you might ask, okay, if battery's so easy, what was the problem, and did they have a light bulb or not? So now you're asking, the harder question, and this goes back to my statement about guilds and knowledge and things being secret. We know from Thomas Edison's work that making a light bulb is actually really hard. So the battery's easy. A light bulb that works is a much more fine-tuned object. And obviously we know you can make them. We have light bulbs all the time, but they just turn out to be really challenging. So you could imagine batteries easy, light bulbs very hard. Very few people in the course of history that might be rarer to discover the light bulb. And if you discover it at a time where you're not likely to share your technology, you might draw it somewhere where you feel it's going to be at least, if you look at the hieroglyphic, it's not enough to figure out how to make a light bulb. So you might be showing off that you can do it, but you don't reveal any of the actual secrets to making it. And then the technology disappears, and without kind of a light bulb and various other technologies, there's really not much motivation to make the batteries much better. So you don't really see battery technology take off until you've gotten broad use of electronics because you've shared the information. So that's why I think, these are they're both interesting because it gives me an excuse to show people how to make a battery. But you also start to develop a sense for which technologies are easier, which are harder, but also just human behavior and activity. This concept of whether we keep things secret or whether we share things is a fascinating part of our history to me.
I agree. Well put. Passing the stick to Karen.
Thank you, John. Okay, Michael, what I'd like to have you have a chance to do is do your shameless plug about your book. Now, it really has an interesting premise. Your book, The Divine Science, Finding Reason at the Heart of Faith, and then your any website information and anything you want people to be sure to know about your appearance at Contact in the Desert. And we'll have a short round after that. I want to give Janet and John are both going to Contact in the Desert. I want you guys to give a minute or two about what you're planning to do. And then we'll wrap up the show. And I think we could probably go all night talking about sciencey stuff. It's awesome. I really appreciate that. So go ahead and tell us about your book and anything else you'd like to.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, so, I think I realized I started to say something that had a point earlier, and I made the one point, but it also was going to make this point. So you asking me this question reminded me of it. And so one of the things about the book that I think is really important for people to understand, as I've said a couple of times, I certainly believe God exists. And, when you look at one of the things that sort of starting and being on Ancient Aliens and talking to people that really struck me is, okay, you have these experiences that people have that are clearly of something more, for lack of a better word. Why would I preferentially view it, say, as a religious experience versus an experience of an extraterrestrial versus a psychological delusion versus something else? How would I decide what else is going on in reality? So because as a scientist, I'm fascinated by the question of how do you answer questions. And so that was one thread and strand that kind of led me to the book. And the other thread or strand I already mentioned, which is a slight frustration where I found both what I would call, sort of literalists from the religion side and, for lack of a better word, literalists from the science side were having these public debates which didn't really seem to go anywhere. And you talk about, unfriendly dialogues. Those seem to be some of the most unfriendly dialogues you have, though I'm sure some of yours between unfriendly skeptics are equally emotional. And I realized that you had these two groups of people who just had a fundamentally different assumption about the way the world worked. And at the end of the day, that's just what it was. It was an assumption. You really couldn't prove one or the other. So bringing this all together, I realized that there's a couple of questions that I think everybody's really asking no matter what language they use. And the first question really is, is all that exists what I would call physical reality, the world that I experience through my five senses and the tools I make as a human to enhance my senses? That is, by definition, the realm that science works in. And it's certainly possible that all that exists is physical reality. And it's certainly interesting, we're doing fascinating things with the brain where you can trigger parts of the brain that create experiences that people would describe exactly like religious experiences or exactly like experiences, out-of-body experiences or other things. And so on the science side, you have people who say, well, look, if I can make this happen in the brain in a way that I know isn't real, then it must not be real. And arguments like that were some of the things that drove me nuts, because I'm like, well, I can also know which part of the brain makes you hungry, and I can make you fake hungry or fake not hungry, but that doesn't make hunger not real. So it was a very bad logical conclusion as far as I could tell. And so it occurred to me that an interesting book to write and an interesting approach to take would be, what if I just assume at the start that there's more to reality than physical reality? What would that more look like, and how would I kind of reconcile, by definition, the more must contain physical reality as I kind of know and experience it. So if I put the two together, what kind of coherent picture do I get? And how does that align with my own personal experience and belief in a God, and particularly a God that loves me and knows me? And so I said, okay, if I'm going to write that sort of book, what kind of questions and interesting things do I need to address? And so there was the standard things. People like to talk about evolution. People like to debate Big Bang creation. So those were kind of easy to write about. But I actually decided to go a little bolder from the science and religious perspective, and I actually talked about miracles, consciousness, free will, and life after death, which I actually called life after life because I didn't like the phrase life after death. I'm getting too old.
I hear that.
Yeah, and one of the things that I talk about in the book is again, trying to make clear what science does know about the physical world, because I definitely feel that no matter what else you experience and what else you think about reality, at the core, science does do a really good job in its space, and it's really important to understand what that space is and how it works. And then where are the boundaries, and where might you need to bring something else to understand the experience in? That was particularly important in the chapters on free will and miracles, because those are areas where I think you most come face to face with the potential boundaries of sort of physical reality, and having to understand what I call non-physical reality, just for I think that's the physicist in me. We don't get very creative with names. And I would love to, at some point I'm going to have to write a second edition, because the miracle chapter I've had the pleasure of writing a follow-up article on, and it's been the one chapter where I think I've been able to refine my thoughts even better just by talking to people. But in the end, one of the things I find most fascinating, and I think humans have struggled with it for our entire history, is the question of free will. How much are we able to actually have choice in what we do, and how much of our future and our life is actually predetermined? If you think of most of the great stories we tell, it's all about, where on that spectrum are we? Is our life fated, or do we actually have control of it? I now, when I talk, I often point out that, to me, that's a much more sort of immediate and interesting question than does God exist or not. It's a question that I think is fascinating to struggle with.
That goes right to the heart of human experience. That's
goes
excellent.
Right to the heart of human experience, and it's one. It's also one that I think. So it's an interesting distinction I make. If you think about consciousness, which I get very specific in my definition of consciousness, just because I wanted to separate free will from consciousness, which often people don't do. They kind of keep the two together. And the reason I did that is I needed a word for being self-aware, and consciousness seemed the best word. I can certainly imagine a purely science, physics explanation down the road of self-awareness, why we think of ourselves as an I and a self, and that lots of other things and entities have self-awareness. I think free will is a much, much different thing from the following perspective. And, as I talk about in the book, when you look at physics as we understand it, you really, no matter how hard you try, I don't think you can come up with an explanation of free will. So if you really do believe that you have some choice in your life, which I personally do, and maybe it's an illusion, then you have to make the step to there's got to be more to the world than physics as we understand it. So it's an interesting place, I think, in which to meet the various type of skeptics, because I think if you are a person who says science is it and science is all there is, but you also believe you have some choice in life, you have a challenge to merge those two. And I think it would be very, very hard. I haven't met anyone who can. And I haven't met everyone in the world, and I haven't read everything, but I think that's one of the biggest challenges out there. So that's kind of, what evolved out of tackling this project in the book. So that's been a lot of fun for me. As I said, my other fun projects, and people can follow me on Twitter at DENNIN Michael, and my Twitter feed varies a lot between mostly being UCI stuff and occasionally being stuff on my book and my talks and other things. But on Facebook at Prof. DENNIN Michael is a little bit more focused. I don't post there as much as I should, but when I'm giving talks or when I'm doing like Contact in the Desert or Comic-Con, or I have to admit, because my last 2 weeks were crazy, I forgot to post. So I'm going to post that I was on the interview. I usually try and pre-post all the interviews I'm doing. But I had limited time on computer, which is rare for me for the last week because of work stuff. So those are kind of the things I'm doing. And so at Contact in the Desert, I'm going to do two things. The talk in the morning that I'm doing really is my standard kind of fun science space travel talk, where we get to do a lot with relativity and have a lot of fun. And then, like I said, I mentioned earlier, the afternoon workshop, I'm really going to go out on a limb and just put it out there. Tell me stuff you think is interesting, and I'll try and talk the science around it.
Oh, that's really fascinating. I love that juxtaposition, and we need more of that cross-pollination between these different groups of ideas that seem contradictory, but we really don't have to engage in adversary creation. We don't have to make anyone the bad guy. We're all trying to figure this out. I even think some of them are really, prickly, porcupine, skeptics somewhere in there. I think they're trying to figure out what the world is all about. But it's life is difficult for everyone, and I think kindness goes a long way, even if you disagree with someone, and that's awesome. I want to give Janet, and we got about 12 minutes. I'd like to give Janet and John a chance to say what they're going to be doing at Contact in the Desert. You guys are all going to meet each other. I'm a little envious, but boy, we've been busy, so it's good. So go ahead, Janet.
Okay, I should probably pull up exactly what we're doing. Let me do that. Dr. Sasha Alex Lesson and I are going to be presenting on two of our favorite topics, the Anunnaki and the experiencers. So a little background on us. When I met Dr. Lesson, he was a psychotherapist with an active practice, and he had been doing so back to the 60s. He's also an anthropologist, and I landed, and he just didn't let me sit there in the other room. He said, "We're doing sessions with clients. You come on in here." So I had a crash course in psychotherapy, and one of the things that started emerging in this practice was it was a kind of a consciousness field, because we were involved with Stan Groff and the holotropic breath work, and accessing these different kind of like shamanic states that people would get into to get information from the cosmos, and they would also go kind of like time and trace space travel back through their past lives to their existence before they came into the physical body, and they would process this information and then come out of this deep hypnotic state in the holotropic breath work and draw a mandala and then explain what they encountered in this 3 hours of breathing deep to evocative music. In our culture here, over in Czechoslovakia, Dr. Groff was able to use LSD-24, and he used it in a therapeutic community at a hospital to see if he could cure people with mental illness. But here, he developed the system using just deep hypnotic state and breath work, and he was able to get pretty amazing results. And one of my husband, Dr. Lesson's colleague, was Dr. John Mack from Harvard, and they were there doing these breathwork classes. And during the period that Dr. Mack uncovered his experiencers phenomena when he was at Harvard, and went to the whole controversy of bringing that out. So we've got a pretty incredible history and wealth of knowledge, and we've been researching. We worked with not Dr., but he was an incredible scholar. And, of course, we, as an anthropologist, Dr. Lesson is an ethnologist, and he combines information. And now he's going from the ancient to the modern, and we're going to look at the history of what happened before the Anunnaki. And the Anunnaki came here 450,000 years ago, and they're still here. So we're looking at the entire cosmology of the universe, and, of course, no one has the answer. And it's going to take a group effort from everybody. So during these presentations, we're hoping to engage with our colleagues, everybody has a piece of the puzzle with things to contribute, and we're going to encourage interaction and question and answer. And we're going to present on the Anunnaki, and then we're going to go in deep into a process where people are going to look at their own experiences and what they encountered, and see if we can, synthesize and co-create some kind of sense out of what are people getting. And I don't have the names for all this stuff because I just know it off the top of my head. And I am so jet-lagged, I can't even think.
Oh, I know. You did pretty well for the rigor of doing this conference we did. And I want to brag on you and Dr. Lesson just a little bit. You guys have a new book, Marduk, King of the Earth, and it's got a fantastic cover, and I think I got a copy, and I'm looking forward to reading it. It looks like an awesome book, and you'll have all your other books with you at your table, so I know you guys will be doing that. People, you got to go meet them, and we're kind of when we're together, we form the Anunnaki corner of these conferences. Was there anything you else want to say, and then we'll let John have a minute?
Yeah, I want to say we do have 6 books in there. It's on the Anunnaki, and there's 2 on experiencers. One has my personal experience. I don't want to take the time with the names. We're shipping as many books as we can, and so please come on down and buy books so I don't have to ship them back and pay all that money. And
yeah.
It's a good deal. Cheaper than on Amazon, right? And
right.
And we're going to do each of the major pantheon gods and goddesses, and so there'll probably be eventually a dozen books if we can get it all together. But we're examining the lives of the characters that have affected the entire planet and their roles and what was behind there. So go to John. We're running out of time. Thank you.
Oh yeah, go ahead, John.
Okay.
I'll be at Contact in the Desert, and I have 2 books myself, but I really wanted to be next to Dr. Sasha and Janet because at UFO Congress, I was right next to them, and we were talking about friendly and not so friendly debates. I have 2 books. My first one, and Karen Christine Patrick is my editor-publicist, is entitled Yahweh, the Biblical God is an Alien, and I got attacked and I got praised for it also. And what was interesting, Michael, is the majority of the people that bought the Yahweh, the Biblical God is an Alien book were men over 60 years old, which I found very interesting. But because they're speakers, they're in a very special speakers area where the speakers' tables are. And since I couldn't be next to them, I decided, the last conference I went to, I didn't listen to one speaker because I was so busy in the vendor room trying to sell my books. So this will be good. That was the first time I'd ever gone to a UFO conference and did not watch or listen to any of the speakers at all. So I look forward to going to this conference. And, if I was stuck in a vendor room somewhere, it probably might have been a big mistake. I would have got my name out there and pushed my own show and my own books. But I think it'll benefit me more by being able to have total freedom and go and listen to some of the most dynamic speakers basically on the face of the planet in this whole industry that we work in. But real quick, I know you could probably do a whole show on this, but real quick, in 1976, we sent the Viking rover to Mars. What kind of technology were they hiding from us? I mean, we were able to stay in constant communication with the rover, both video and electronic communication with the rover back in 1976. And then I'm talking to my girlfriend on the phone who was driving up to Atlanta, and my cell phone and her cell phone cut out 3 or 4 times. You know, so what's up with the technology? How could it have been so advanced in 1976 unless maybe we had help from somebody else?
Hello?
Did we lose Michael?
Oh, nope, I'm here. Sorry. I wasn't sure if that was a question.
Can you do that
or
one in
just a
2 minutes?
In 2 minutes. You know, I think one of the things, I have 2 answers to that. One is, it is certainly true. You know, I go back to my question about my comment about secrets and non-secrets, that unfortunately, though science is pretty open, it is certainly true that I think a lot of technology is always more advanced for the military and takes a while to propagate out. The other thing, though, that is true is the type of sort of electromagnetic waves and the way we communicate with our spacecraft is actually just enough different from the spectrum that we use for our cell phones and that sort of communication. You know, it's sort of why, like, the ham radio operators can communicate over much greater distances more easily with each other, because they're usually using more fundamentally radio wave-based stuff, which is a longer wavelength than what we use in our cell phones, which is a shorter wavelength. So they get to do things like bounce their waves off the atmosphere, which doesn't work with the cell phone, where you need an actual tower to bounce it off of and communicate. So there are big differences between the technology, and, you know, there's a lot of areas in which the military does get things first.
That was the best short answer you could have possibly done.
Yeah,
fantastic. There you go.
Brilliant.
So, everybody go check out Contact in the Desert. It's just pretty much burgeoned into one of the biggest events and the best speakers on the planet, as John said. I believe it's contactinthedesert.com. And it's a wonderful event. And like I said, I wish I was going, but I want to tell people about what I'm up to. Is my partner and I are working on an online bookstore with some books that nobody's ever seen on the planet. Yeah, well, in English anyway. So we're going to be bringing that on in the next month or two, and we're going to have the authors that I've worked with, as well as some new ones that I'm working with right now. We're very excited. Brett Collins Shepard and I are very excited about doing this. And we'll let everybody know when that happens. But in the meantime, I just want to say love and blessings to everyone. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, John. This is a chance to say goodbye. The music comes up. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye. Thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Bye. Aloha. Thank you. Blessings.
See you next week, Janet and Michael.
See you there.
Okay, yep. See you in Joshua Tree. Talk to you guys later.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Thank you for listening to Aquarian Radio Friday nights, The Experiencer Path. Thanks to the artists from freemusicarchive.org, Ketsa for Live With No Fear, and Scott Holmes, Mother Nature. You have been listening to the Aquarian Radio Network.